So it's a talk about Android, but first of all, I'm going to do the obligatory about me slide. So my name is Andy Pannell, and yeah, I'm a penetration tester, offensive security specialist. I work for Sage, so the largest software company in the UK, and my job is an internal pen tester. I do a bit of red team in there, and I've kind of got a history of consultancy working for various kind of FTSE 100 companies and startups, scale-ups. But my main real interest in cybersecurity is mobile applications, specifically Android. So I've been interested in Android since about 2008. Despite my accent, I live in the Northeast, and I was the first person in Newcastle to get the very first Android phone. And my interest in Android OS and Android malware kind of started from that kind of phase of very first picking up an Android device. And as part of my standard about me, I always talk about race cars. So as well as InfoSec, race cars is my other hobby. So if I'm generally not at one on a computer or on a mobile phone looking at malware, I'm normally found at the track. So this is my car in Germany. So I'm going to be talking about Flash keyboard and some research that I did a little bit a while ago. I guess most people probably haven't heard of Flash keyboard, and I certainly hadn't before I started this research and piece of work. So Flash keyboard is a custom Android keyboard, and since the Android was released in 2008, and kind of by default since the very first release of Android, you could run custom keyboards, use third-party keyboards, and it's often if you want to change the appearance of the keyboard itself that comes with the operating system, or maybe that you want a different prediction engine, and it generally is around the idea that you want to make the user experience better. And Flash keyboard was developed by a Chinese app developer called .c, and that's important. I'll come around to that in a moment. But what happened is I got bored of the keyboard that I was using on my Android device, and I just went onto the Google Play Store and I've just put in keyboard. So I scrolled through and found the most popular keyboard downloaded apps at the time was Flash keyboard. And when you go to the Google Play Store, you get a bit of a description, and it tells you, about what the application does, and it's written by the developer. So the first thing, this is actually the description of Flash keyboard from the keyboard. And I kind of weird that it says Flash keyboard values your privacy. We do not collect any personal data without your explicit permission. And I thought that's a really weird thing to put in a description of a keyboard application. Fine, okay, so that definitely, as an InfoSec person, made me want to read more about the application. And then the next thing it did, and I can't tell if this smiley is an ironic thing or sarcastic or whether they're trying to just be friendly, but it said rest assured you can use Flash keyboard safely with like a little smiley face. And I thought, okay, yeah, I definitely want to have a look at this application. I'm going to download it and investigate a little bit more. So just to backtrack about the kind of how the Google Play App Store kind of works. As I kind of mentioned before, the keyboard I was using was a bit laggy. I wanted something a bit quicker. I wanted something with a bit better prediction engine. So I went on into the Google Play Store at the time, and I typed in keyboard, and this was the most popular downloaded keyboard at the time of this research. And this was the 11th most downloaded app in the world at this time. And again, I've never heard this app before this research, and quite honestly, no one I've spoken to has heard this app, which is quite astounding considering it's the 11th most downloaded app. So, to kind of highlight how popular it was downloaded, hence the title of this talk, somewhere between 50 and 100 million times. So if I want to kind of give a little bit of background about how popular this app was. So arguably everyone's heard of Facebook Messenger, right? Even if they don't use it, they were aware of what it is. It was the most commonly downloaded app at the time when I downloaded Flash keyboard. The second most popular downloaded app was Snapchat. The 7th most downloaded app was Instagram. And then the 11th most downloaded app was Flash keyboard. So somewhere between 50 and 100 million downloads. Google Play doesn't give me anything more than that, so it could be 50, it could be it could be 99 million, but somewhere in that region. So for an app that the majority of people I spoke to haven't heard of, that's pretty incredible. And to add even more context to this, Netflix, which was the 13th most downloaded app, so Netflix at the time was downloaded less times than Flash keyboard. Spotify, the 14th most popular downloaded application, and the terrorist's choice, WhatsApp, due to its brilliant encryption, as we're reminded, was the 15th most downloaded application. And in case no one's ever used Android or unfamiliar of how it works, I'll kind of give you an idea of what Flash Keyboard looks like. So it just overlays the default keyboard. The idea is you can change the background. So I did this talk in Scotland, completely forgetting that I put the St. George's Cross in there, and you can imagine how well that went down. So yeah, never mind, whoops. But yeah, and you can see like you just change the appearance of it. It looks a little bit different, and it's got a better prediction engine than. The idea is it's got a better prediction engine than the stock Android keyboard. So I want to talk about permissions because this is a really important part of this presentation. So when I did the research, there was a couple of billion Android devices running worldwide, and before Android 6.0, which is called Marshmallow, Google had this weird idea around permissions where you don't need, so when you download the application, you get presented with the permissions, and you either install the application and accept all of those permissions, or you don't install the application and therefore you don't get the application, but you declined all those permissions. Now it's moved away from that slightly now over the last couple of years, and iOS has kind of always had this sort of thing where you accept and decline permissions more granular. But at the time of this, the majority of people that downloaded the application, 50 million, had kind of agreed with the request of permissions of the application and installed it. And that's important for the context of what I'm going to say this evening. So let's talk about permissions since I've mentioned those already. So I'm going to compare the stock Android, it's called AOSP keyboard, and Flash keyboard in terms of permissions. So the stock Android keyboard, it has 15 permissions. It needs to do quite a bit of things. It needs to hold a dictionary. It needs to be to remember words. It needs to gather data from messages, maybe. So it needs 15 permissions, which that's probably about right, given that in fact this is a Google product. It's probably going to harvest some of your data at least, right? The Flash keyboard application, bearing in mind it's doing exactly the same thing as the Google stock keyboard, was 49 permissions. So I mean, by my maths, 3 times or more than 3 times as many permissions to do exactly the same job. So it's like, right, okay. So it's got 50 million downloads, so it's 11th most downloaded application in the Google Play Store, but it's got 3 times as many permissions needed as the stock Google Android keyboard. This definitely is an InfoSec person made me want to look and find out what was going on with the keyboard. So you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go for all 49 permissions and talk about every single one of them, but I'll go through some of the ones that I think are important and explain why. So it wanted to read in my SMS and MMS, and that's kind of fine, right? It probably wants to learn words. Like I can't pretend that I'm young anymore and understand what kids say nowadays, but whatever kids say, it probably wants to recognize that word, learn it. When you use it repeatedly in a sentence, learn some kind of context. Fine, that's probably kind of normal. Wanted my location, kind of weird for an application that just I used to type, and to the point where it used GPS on network location data. So GPS, depending on the chipset on your device, is somewhere between 1 meter and 10 meters of accuracy. So that's pretty close accuracy for again, just a keyboard. Wanted to disable my lock screen. That's pretty weird. It's just a lock screen. Not sure why a keyboard application would need that, to overlay that kind of screen, but fine. It wanted to download files without notification. So on Android, whenever you download a file, you normally have a little arrow in the upper status bar. As an application downloads a file, it lets you know the file's downloaded and completed. What Flash Keyboard could do would call out to any server it wanted and download a file without notifying the user. Really invasive and really weird. It wanted to access Bluetooth settings. Again, that's really weird. This wasn't a Bluetooth keyboard I was downloading. It was an app. It wasn't a physical keyboard. Not sure why it needed access to Bluetooth. And it wanted to modify some system settings, which basically meant any setting within Android running so if you've got Android, if you go to settings, any of those settings about Wi-Fi, about VPNs, about anything, it wanted to access and change those. Again, really weird for what is contextually a keyboard. So I looked. Sorry. So the way that a mobile phone normally connects is that it goes straight out to the cloud, right? Like you open your device and it goes, if you type to google.com or whatever, the internet connection goes straight out onto the internet. But because I'm an InfoSec person and because I wanted to know what this application was doing, I thought I'm going to stick a proxy in the middle between my device and the internet. So I'm just going to demonstrate this by sticking a well-known proxy in the middle, and boom, I can see anything that Flash Keyboard is doing. So every time I type something, every time my Flash Keyboard app opens and sends information, I can see exactly what's going on. So I thought, brilliant, I'm going to have a look. So I plug it in, I take a look at the first request, I do it for an emulator, and I get this mess, this binary mess. I'm like, okay, that's pretty weird. So this is encoded somehow, so let me try and figure out what's going on. So I tried a few different messages, formats, and I couldn't understand what was going on, like just a random blob of data. And this was happening every time I was typing something. So I was like, this is, I wonder what's going on. You know, why is it sending these massive post requests to some random server? And bearing in mind that's talkingdata.net is a Chinese analytics company, so it isn't even .c who developed the application where this data is going to. It's some other third-party service. So I was like, this is really strange. I need to figure out what's going on with this. So one of the brilliant things why I like working with Android is because it's pretty trivial to return the application to source code. So I'm going to demonstrate this by not speaking French, because I do not speak French. But the idea is that if you translate something from English, like I'm talking about the Flash Keyboard app, translate it into French using Google Translate, and then translate it back into English, you get something like I speak the application of Flash Keyboard. So you don't quite get the same as what you started with, but you kind of get the same message. And that's kind of how it works with reverse engineering an Android application. So you don't get any kind of the comments, you don't get quite the same code back when you reverse engineer it, but you get a very similar understanding of what the application is doing, and you kind of get the developer's intent behind that. So I went ahead and reverse engineered, or I don't think Google liked that term, and I think that might be forbidden in the terms of service replace, so I should probably change this to binary analyze. But yeah, I reverse engineered the application, and I found it was using this gzip output stream, kind of shown here. So that's what it was using to encode the data that it was sending across to this analytics server. So I thought, brilliant, I'm going to use that to have a look at this binary blob that I mentioned earlier. And just to kind of notice that the talkingdata.net IP and domain are in there. So whatever is capturing this data must have a pretty big infrastructure behind. If it's got 50 million downloads and it's doing numerous amount of these requests, that's a pretty big infrastructure to capture a lot of data. So I went ahead and I turned the binary blob into some useful data. And it turns out that what was contained in that blob of data that I mentioned, that binary mess earlier, is the device manufacturer model. Mildly interesting, I guess, if you've got an exploit that you wanted to deploy, it works against a certain device, you'd be able to get that kind of information. It would take the IMEI number of the device. That's quite interesting. It's quite sensitive, arguably. It would take my email address. So my email address generally forms a line of my first name dot surname at something. Is that private information, potentially sensitive information? GDPR, maybe. I haven't quite got a proper answer on this, but yeah, if it's containing my name, maybe that is sensitive. I mentioned about the GPS coordinates, or the fact that it had the ability to triangulate my address using the network and the GPS. It was sending those across to this analytics server. It was also capturing what mobile network I was on, so Vodafone at the time. It would capture the details of any VPN I was using. So that's pretty interesting in the sense that that's quite a lot of data that's being sent over HTTP, I should add. So this is being transmitted unencrypted to a third-party analytics server. So what I also noticed that they were doing, it was taking up my SSID. So my network, my home Wi-Fi network, was being captured, details about that, and being transmitted across. But then what it would do, it would actively start scanning. So it would use my my device as almost like a scanner, and find out what other Wi-Fi networks were nearby, and take that data and send it across. Which is really interesting because when I start doing pen testing, I define a scope, and then I get my manager or the boss or a customer to agree that scope, and it gets signed off, and then that prevents me from breaking the computer misuse act normally. So it's normally quite a strict scope, and this is it's kind of weird that it's actively scanning guest networks nearby. So it's telling, if you were someone nefarious and you wanted to target someone, what device they're using, based on GPS coordinate locations where they are, if they're using a VPN and information about that VPN, and yeah, you know the SSID, their GPS coordinates. So and maybe you know their name if their email address is first name dot surname. So all of a sudden you know a lot of information about a user. It'd be quite good if you was you know, wanted to target an election, or you know, you had something that you wanted you've got a database of 50 million people, and you want to target a very particular person. That'd be quite a hell of a database and quite interesting. So this is the lock screen, the device that I was using for testing. And in case you've not seen an Android lock screen before, this is kind of what it looks like. It's pretty boring. It just shows the time. It shows you any kind of recent download. So that's my birth certificate that's on there that I used to proxy the data. And it shows the charging status, like really, really boring. It shows you any notifications. It shows you've got messages, that kind of thing. It's nothing special. But as I mentioned, the Flash Keyboard application had access to my lock screen. So it was able to disable a lock screen and apply a new one. So the Flash Keyboard application actually improved my lock screen, which was really great. And when I say improved, I mean it definitely did not improve the lock screen. It just put adverts onto the device. So every time I unlock the device, or I unlock when I go to my lock screen, I now get these adverts before I then get access to my device. And it's kind of like the Amazon did on Kindle. I think if you pay £10 less, you get adverts on the device every time you unlock it. You know, I kind of understand that, but this isn't what I expected from a keyboard application. And this is the first time that I've seen this. So I spoke to a developer friend of mine, and I was like, why would an application put adverts on the screen? Is it for financial gain? So he's like, yeah, the average person unlocks a device 85 times a day. If we go on the conservative side of things, this application's got 50 million users, and around about 10 cents a time of someone physically viewing an advert, that's a whole lot of money, right? And I kind of understand that developers kind of make, you know, this Flash Keyboard application was free, so they clearly invested in, and you know, they're paid for developers, pay for their time, and they wanted to recoup some of that money. But yeah, inserting you know, lock screens onto my device that when it was never called out in the description, it never said it was going to do that, and it had that weird smiley face that you can trust my data. I thought it was kind of odd, if not nefarious. Yeah, really, really weird. So I just kind of want to recap what we know so far. So we know that the application was installed by 50 million 50 million users, at the very minimum, somewhere between 50 and 100 million at the time I did the research. We know that the application takes our data, and it takes a lot of data based on some of the reverse engineering / binary analysis that I did. We know that the application inserts adverts onto the device. And is it malware? So at work, I went back to some of my colleagues and I was like, this is really weird and it's really bad, but is this malware? So I went to the source of knowledge that is Wikipedia, and I pulled up the definition of malware. And I'll read it out. We're all adverts, but I'll read it out just for context. So it says malware, short for malicious software, is any software used to disrupt computer operations, gather sensitive information. I mean, it's my email address, my VPN details, my GPS coordinates, what device I'm using, my IMEI. I guess that's sensitive information. Gain access to private computer systems. Maybe it's not doing that. Or displaying unwanted adverts. Well, we know it's displaying unwanted adverts, so it's doing 2 of the 4 things, and it's or. So we kind of between us agreed that yeah, this is probably hits the definition of what malware is. Cool. So I'm just going to uninstall it, right? You know, I know it's only on an emulator, but I don't want to use this application anymore. It's doing some really weird, funky stuff. I'm just going to uninstall it. No, sorry, Dave, can't do that. Can't uninstall. And this is the first kind of time I've come across this on an Android app. So you go click on uninstall, and you get this kind of warning saying this package is unable to be installed because it's a device administrator. So this is another permission that I didn't notice when I was going through the initial 49. So what it does is it grants itself admin permissions over the device, which means that you can't just click on install and drag it, you know, to the bin, or you know, however you want to install it. You know, even if you use a third-party uninstall application, because it's an admin, you can't uninstall that application. And it does have legitimate admin rights. Do have a legitimate purpose. So if you think you've got a corporate device which has a corporate email on, that corporate email, an MDM solution may want to lock the device. You don't want someone to just uninstall that MDM solution. So you put things like this in place. And you may want to remotely wipe the device. but it does mean that because the Flash keyboard application has the ability to create a lock screen, as we saw with the adverts, it also has the ability to set a password, and it then in theory could create mobile ransomware because it could call out to a third-party server, download the file without notifying the user it's downloading a file, and then start to encrypt the device. And this is kind of how it's working. So it's activating in the background. I manually triggered this, but it's activating the administration function, essentially abusing that technique to make it harder to install. And in fact, when I looked at this application and I put it into Google, I put uninstall, and there was like Reddit threads of people going, I don't know how to uninstall this device. It's putting adverts on uninstall this application to put adverts on my device. That was the most commonly used like asked question about this device. So at the time I did this research, I was working for a security company, and we had a responsible disclosure policy. So I followed the responsible disclosure policy. So when I did this in February, a couple of years ago, I contacted the developers and said, look, first of all, your app, .c United, you developed the application, but this application is taking data and sending it to Talking Data, some random third-party analytics company, unencrypted. What's going on? Did you just, like most developers I've met, like did you just copy stuff from Stack Overflow, not realizing what's going on? And you've embedded this weird SDK and it's doing weird stuff. I contacted them through the email address on the Play Store, the email address on the website, and they had a third-party email address hidden in the application. Got no response. So I then contacted Google, got no response from Google, but a couple of days later, the app just disappeared from the Play Store, just gone, like nothing back to me, no explanation about what's going on. I then released some research about this, and the BBC got in touch, and a couple of media companies saying, we want to know what's going on. The Register got in touch saying, we want to cover this story, which I thought, from my point of view, was quite interesting. And then a couple of days later, the application returns. They called it Flash Keyboard Lite. It was the same developer, but the problem was it didn't have this 50 million downloads anymore. It started from one download, which means you've not got a reputation because they were the 11th most downloaded application in the Play Store. More people download it. The more people download it, the higher up it gets in the store. More people download it. So there's an element of trust in this, and that the higher downloaded it up, the more people will download it. So I thought it was really weird. I compared the source code of the Flash Keyboard Lite application and the source code of the Flash Keyboard malicious application, exactly the same. They've just re-released the application back onto the Play Store. So I want to talk about some lessons learned. Is that just because something's popular doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. Justin Bieber, I think, is a pretty good point. Just because an app is on the Google Play Store doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe. So this was a few years ago now, but Pokemon Go came out on the iOS App Store, and before it could be released on the Google Play Store, people just created malware, uploaded it as Pokemon Go. People downloaded it, and put their devices in jeopardy. So read the permissions. There is probably applications that do need 49 permissions, but a keyboard is probably not one of them. And it's contextual around, why does this application need this permissions? Why does this application need these particular permissions? And kind of the underlying thought of this is think before you click the link. Why does it look at the permissions? Look what the application's doing. And this is where I intended to finish my talk. I released a white paper. I was working for Pannell Limited at the time. I documented all of my evidence around what I'd found. Submitted my BERT blogs for anyone to view who wanted them to. And then the company .c their lawyers rather sent me a lovely cease and desist letter, which I still have framed on my wall, basically saying that I'm not allowed I shouldn't be disseminating this kind of wrongful, harmful information. But they never said what I'd done wrong. They just said, please don't, please cease and desist. But never, they never disputed any of the claims that I'd made or provided information to say that that I was wrong. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm still happy to talk about it. The real irony is that a keyboard can detect every input that you make. So every character that you type could be logged by that keyboard and sent. And the irony is that of all the things that it did badly, or maliciously, or whatever you want to call it, the irony is that it didn't do that, which I think is brilliant and weird. But yeah, so thanks very much for listening. One of the reasons why I figured that they sent me this letter is that they got $45 million in funding. So I guess the lawyers probably didn't like it when the fact that the media kind of picked up on my white paper, and the first thing when you see typing Flash keyboard into Google for a while was this application is malware. So I guess that's probably why they got in touch with me. But yeah, thank you for listening. I'm around if you want to ask any questions immediately afterwards. I'm also on Twitter, or if there's anything you want to ask me later and you don't think of now, feel free to drop me an email.